Welcome to the Beginner Photography Podcast. Today, we are getting some fresh air in our lungs and learning landscape photography from a true legend. So let's get into it.
Welcome to the Beginner Photography Podcast, a weekly podcast for those who believe that moments matter most and that a beautiful photo is more than just a sum of its settings. A show for those who want to do more with the gear they have to take better photos today. And now, your host, Raymond Hatfield.
Welcome back to this episode of the Beginner Photography Podcast. As always, I am your host, Raymond Hatfield, and I'm happy to be here today. Today we have a great interview that I know that all of you who love landscapes, want to get into landscapes more, are just truly going to love. Today's guest is not only a true master of his craft, but he's also super easy to talk to and full of great stories. You're going to find this interview a lot of fun. So we'll definitely get into that shortly. But first, I want to give a huge listener shout out to Great Indiana Man for leaving the podcast a 5-star iTunes review. Great Indiana Man said, and I swear it's not me, said, Raymond is a great interviewer. His episodes dig deep into who photographers are and how they do what they do. Somehow, he's able to key it all entertaining. That's a great Indiana typo for a great Indiana man. He continues that this is a great podcast for anyone interested in photography, no matter the skill level. Now, Great Indiana Man is actually Stephen Van Elk, who's the co-host of the Wedding Photo Hangover podcast. So, Stephen, thank you so much for your review. Your check is in the mail, but I accidentally addressed it to Sony Pony, so you might have to take Dustin to go with you to cash it. I'm sorry about that. To everybody else, if you enjoy the podcast, please consider leaving a review on iTunes. You can do it from the app that you are currently in right now, and it is a great way to show your support of the podcast. It really helps us out. Not only show other listeners that this is a serious podcast, but also show more potential guests that we take things seriously and that we enjoy learning photography over here. Now, as always, a portion of this interview that focuses on how to make money with your camera is saved just for premium members. So this week, premium members will learn how to get started selling landscape photos, shooting on assignment versus shooting personal work, and then selling the images after the capture, and then all about licensing. Gary goes deep into how licensing has changed in recent years and how you can take advantage of the change and how much to charge. So much to learn, so much to learn. If you want to learn how a real pro makes money with landscape photos, then become a premium member today by clicking the premium membership button at the top of beginnerphotographypodcast.com. With that, today I interview Gary Crabbe, who is one of the world's just leading landscape photographers with a long list of accomplishments, including the one that you're going to hear in just a second in my first question. You are going to find that Gary, again, is incredibly friendly. He's as friendly as he is knowledgeable. Maybe he's more friendly than he is knowledgeable. Regardless, he's very knowledgeable about photography and he's very friendly. So with that, let's get into it. In 2018, 7 of your landscape images were chosen by the U.S. Postal Service to represent just how beautiful America is in a series of stamps. Now, I want to take a step back from that just monumental achievement right there, and I want to know how you got into photography in the first place.
Oh, that's a really easy answer, and it's a question I do get asked a lot. I was a breakfast cook.
Okay, let's go on. Let's elaborate from that. How does being a breakfast cook continue?
No, actually, I was so absolutely sick to death of waking up every morning at ungodly hours that I actually now waking up again that early. But I literally woke up with a stream of profanities coming out of my mouth saying I didn't want to go to work. And my wife basically said, well, find a different job. And so I basically started applying for anything I could find out of the newspaper, and that included answering telephones at an adoption agency, a telemarketer, I didn't care what the job was, as long as it was a normal Monday through Friday 9 to 5 job.
Wait, that's what you wanted? Was the normal
That's what
Monday
I wanted,
Okay.
because as opposed to waking up really early and cooking, and I had to spend my weekends cooking and stuff like that, at that point I wanted some sense of normalcy. And I think I was maybe about 24. It was right after I had graduated from college. And one of the ads that I saw in the paper it said, outdoor photo agency must love dogs. Okay. And so I applied for it and got asked to come in for an interview. And as soon as I showed up at the doorway, I recognized it was the studio of, even then, a world famous National Geographic photographer named Galen Rowell. And the only reason I recognized who it was immediately was because I had seen his Mountain Light exhibit in person at the California Academy of Sciences a number of years before that. And his, famous shot of the rainbow over the Potala Palace is like a world-class signature photo. And I was just kind of like, oh my God. And surprisingly, I did get offered the job of basically just being a little file boy. My job was going to be taking all the slides back from clients, because in this time there was no digital photography, not even digital scans. So everything was done on slides, and they needed someone to put all the slides back into those same sort of file drawers that you see behind me. And so I did get hired. I got paid less than I was as a cook. And surprisingly, I did ask for and got a raise on my very first day of work.
Day one, starting off the
Day
relationship
one,
strong.
I was like, so they agreed. They gave me, we split the difference on what I was losing. But literally 9 days after I started working there, I went off on my 3-week honeymoon. So actually, I guess my wife was my fiance at the time this first started happening. But within that 9 days, I was exposed to all of this world-class photography. And I figured, oh, here I am. I'm going off to Hawaii on my honeymoon. I've got my little old manual Minolta X370, and I was going to be like the next Galen Rowell. I took, like 10 rolls of those print film negatives that you develop in the drugstore, and there were shots of rainbows and palm trees and sunsets, and they were all like, I knew nothing about it. I came back from my honeymoon 3 weeks later, and literally the moment I walk in the door, the manager of the office goes, Galen and Barbara need to see you in their office right now. I mean, we're talking 8:30 in the morning after my first day on the honeymoon, and I'm being summoned into the office. And I get into the office, and they say, the people that are running your department are no longer here. We've let them go. Do you think you can run the department? And I went, sure. I can do.
Does it come with a raise?
I
Yeah,
had no clue what I was doing, but I said, absolutely, I can do it. And so they put me on like a 90-day probation period to see if I could keep up with what I said. That turned out to be a decade that I wound up staying there, and I was running this image library of 400,000 slides, dealing with all of some of the top publishing companies, agencies, magazines, ad agencies in the world, which was great because that was training ground for me as a photo editor. So that's literally what I consider part of my business, is not just photography, but I also do photo editing as well. And the benefit, though, as the photographer was that Galen taught workshops out of his office there in Berkeley, and I had to work them. So I got the training of being and sitting through over the course of years, like probably about 30 or more of his workshops that he led. And at some point, we got even to a point where I was helping teach them and working with the students out in the field and stuff like that as part of the job. But the greatest point of the education was always like the slide critiques, where you would listen to Galen critique the slides, and that started to be like, oh, I just had all that information sinking into me. It turns out, ironically though, they would refuse to hire photographers. They had been burned by photographers a number of times. So when I was hired, it was like, do you want to be a photographer? And I'm like, no interest in being a photographer. And oddly enough, 9 years later, when I left, I wound up having enough information and skills that I was able to start my own photography business. So.
Okay, hold on. There's a lot of questions I just wrote down here on this little piece of paper here about that story. First of all, what did that have to do with dogs? I didn't hear anything about dogs in that whole story.
Oh, Galen had a golden retriever named Kumbu, and that dog basically lived with us in the office at all times. And
Gotcha.
When they were gone, we had to care for the dog. So yeah, that was one of the requirements walking into the dog. And that was actually on my cover letter, was like, you know, I may not know what a photo agency is, but I like dogs.
But it had nothing to do with shooting dogs, nothing like that. No photographing dogs.
Nope.
Okay. At least they're focusing on everything that's important there, right? You got to be welcome to the family before you can take a photo. So before starting, did you have any prior photography knowledge up until that point? I know that you said that you had a Minolta camera.
Yes.
But how much did you know about photography before you had started?
Not a lot. I knew how to point and push the button and keep it on the automatic mode. I had taken a black and white elective photography course through my art department in college. And that was the sum total, 1 semester in the darkroom. However, I did wind up getting a job working for the university that I was at. I was getting my master's degree in the theater, and so I became the official photographer for the theater. So from that black and white class, I was able to adapt to shooting in the theater, where I used 3200 speed. And since I had experience with both acting and directing, they would let me run around on stage with the actors during one of their final dress rehearsals. And so I would basically get the film that I shot from the dress rehearsal, run back to my apartment, process it all in my bathroom with a little darkroom unit that I had bought during the course of that class. And I processed all of these 8x10 RC glossy prints of the theater production, and in the morning I dropped them off with the art department, and in the afternoon they were lining the walls of the theater. And that was it. That was photography job number 1, and the sum total of experience I had before I walked into that other job. But that was probably just enough to help me get that job, because they definitively didn't want photographers, but you know, I had just little bit of experience, and that was it.
Yeah, it definitely helps knowing certain aspects about a camera before you go in. You don't want to go in completely blind, so that makes sense. I love that. My next question is when it came to this is just so much. I love this story. So you had you said that your master's in theater directing, right?
Yep.
Okay, so clearly, like you enjoy being in the company of people. What I want to know now is that, like, when did you decide that landscapes, which arguably maybe one of the loneliest forms of photography, would be something that you were going to pursue full time. What was it about landscapes that really drew you in?
Probably the fact that when I was young, as a teenager and a kid and young adult, that I had grown up fishing and camping with my parents. And as I started to get older into my teen years, I started doing backpacking and getting out into some of the wilderness, especially up by like Lake Tahoe and parts of Yosemite and stuff like that. And I also had this one specific memory of when I was a kid. We had driven across country from, at the time I was living in New Jersey, and we drove and came back into California. And I remember jumping out of the camper and just seeing the majesty of Mount Shasta over Highway 5, which is just, in fact, I was just there a little while ago. And every time I see this big, huge volcanic peak towering, 10,000 feet over the surrounding landscape, it's just, the jaw-dropping awe of nature, the natural processes, and the fact that it's the part of the planet that will go on and has been here long before and long after humans. So it is that point where you can escape everything else that is around us and retreat just back to what is the real kind of Mother Earth aspect.
So it's funny that you mentioned that. I remember, as you said, Lake Shasta. I told you that I grew up in Northern California. My grandma lives in Redding, and every year we would go up there to see her, and we'd go camping at, I think it's Whiskey Town, Whiskey Lake.
Yep, exactly. Great place.
Yeah, and I believe that one of my first photographs, now that I think about it, is of Shasta as we were driving up 5. And now I'm going to have to ask my mom if she can go back through my old scrapbooks and find that photo. That's going to be really awesome. Yeah,
yeah, it is just something. It's like walking up to the rim of the Grand Canyon the first time, or seeing Half Dome for the first time, or looking at the Swiss Alps. You just, it is something that is transcendent and literally goes right, I think, to the core of kind of our own being. So when those moments hit, and that's what attracted me.
Definitely makes an impact, that's for sure. So when you went to Hawaii, right, on your honeymoon, you had your 10 rolls of film, you had your Minolta, you go out, you're super excited to take all these photos. When you get back and you develop them, they're all... What would you say was the hardest part about photography at that point for you, from the technical side, for you to learn?
I think so. Obviously, there was the basics like exposure and composition. But one of the things that Galen's talked a lot about, and people don't understand right now in the digital world, if they've grown up totally in the digital world, we did not have little LCD panels on the back of our screen where we can immediately see what we were getting. And so probably he used this phrase, learning to see like film. In other words, you could look out there and through this lens of basically what was a foreign language, understanding how the film was going to see the world differently than how our eyes were seeing it. You could start making compositional and artistic choices based on what you knew the palette of the film was going to do versus what your eyes were seeing. And that was probably a huge quantum jump, because compared to that, learning things like, your rule of thirds and, diagonals being good, don't put something directly in the center. Those were kind of the more easy technical aspects, but suddenly learning to think in the language of photography was a much better step up the ladder than any of those small instructions, because it allowed me to start making more critical choices when I was in the field. And there's a famous photographer named Art Wolf, who I think it was him, who said, you know, the hallmark of a good photographer is knowing what photo not to take. Mm. And so as we learned this kind of language of film and the language of composition and the language of light itself, as beginning photographers, you just run around, you point your camera and you push the button. You literally have no clue. It's like, oh, that kind of looks nice, I'll take the picture. Oh, that looks good, I'll take the picture. But then once you start learning all these things, you can go, no, that's not good. Maybe if I move over here, or maybe if I change this or change that, you can start reacting to the world around you, making informed choices. So that aspect of like learning to see like film and to understand what I was going to get in the camera without having to look on the back of my camera to see if it's okay first, that's something the modern world, you know, doesn't teach you, but I thought was a great resource. But there is the way, you know, light and subject matter comes together in that little two-dimensional frame, that is it's like learning a second language. And once you become fluent in the language, you're able to basically speak it much clearer.
When you become fluent in the language, you're able to speak it much clearer. How do you become fluent in that language?
That's a lot of practice, you know, and it's a lot of mistakes, and it's a lot of really looking to see what doesn't work. A really easy example, and I think even Gustavo had mentioned it in his little interview the other day, was that, you know, have someone try bracket their exposures and just put them all up on the screen and look at what it does. Try and feel how your eye moves through a frame. I'm sorry, I thought I'd put all these ringers to silent.
No worries.
Yeah. Unbelievable. So, my apologies. I literally
thought you were a
both phones
professional
here, and I had basically set them all to silent and had them sitting here on silent figures.
The whole world's against you, I swear.
I'm not a fan of technology, let me tell you that. So going back, you know, that was the other probably big step that helped understanding this kind of fluency of photography, was understanding how, as a photographer, my connection to a subject comes across in a photograph, and understanding things like, you know, how light and shadow work together in a frame, but most importantly, how does our eye move through the frame? Because if you create a great visual path and your subject matter can literally jump off the page at the size of a postage stamp, you know you're doing something right. But if someone looks at that and your subject is either dead centered and there's nothing there, or there's a whole bunch of jumbled stuff on the side, a viewer's going to look at that and they're going to feel that kind of confusion and that sort of odd tangle of information, so that their brain doesn't process it nicely. And that harkens back to, I think, what the famous line of, there are always, you know, two people in a photograph, the photographer and the viewer.
Yes.
And so starting to think like a viewer of a photographer and making things easy for the viewer is one of the steps along that path that's really important.
There was a lot right there, I think, to unpack when it comes to what goes into a landscape photo, and obviously what makes one better than another. So, right. If I were to ask you to close your eyes and describe the perfect landscape photo, what elements are you seeing? What elements are most important to you?
First and foremost is light, because that's what photography is. I mean, you can strip everything out of it, but if you don't have light, you don't have a photo.
Mhm.
And one of the things I like to teach is that's what we take pictures of. We don't take pictures of things, we take pictures of light on things. And I've always said and continued to say that a great, let me get this exactly right. A boring subject in great light will always make a better photograph than a great subject in boring light. So you can have a beautiful mountain in the middle of the day look substantially less impressive than a park bench at sunset in perfect light.
That's true. That's absolutely true.
So that's the very, very, very first thing. I think about the light first, and then I think I match it to the subject. So whenever I'm looking around, like outside my office right now, I can see some beautiful morning light hitting my tomatoes and bean plants and cucumbers and stuff like that. I'm like, oh, that's pretty. But it's the light that's catching my attention, not the subject.
Mhm.
And I go, oh, there's the pretty light. That's what I'm going to photograph. So obviously for an outdoor landscape, weather is key, timing is key. If it's cloudy and gray, I'm not thinking about big landscapes. I'm thinking about smaller details or possibly doing something in black and white. There's a reason that landscape photographers and travel photographers are drawn to what they call the magic hour, you know, the hours between sunrise and or around sunrise and around sunset, is because that as the sun gets lower in the sky, it's traveling through more atmosphere and it's getting, you know, more and more golden and eventually turning to red. And that light makes such a special quality on anything it falls. So the first thing I would think about is, you know, am I going to get some beautiful light either on trees, mountains, clouds especially? Is there a lake or body of water that I could reflect that in? Would there be a nice foreground subject like a rock with a nice angle that I can start leading the viewer into? And can I construct a scene that I think is going to evoke an emotional response so that when someone sees it, they know exactly what I was seeing, what I was passionate about, but moreover than that, that it hits them in some manner with their own kind of emotional response so that they can say, oh, I want to be there. I want to see that. I want to live in that scene. And that's kind of one of the things, you know, as a photo editor critique when people are going through and I'm looking through their portfolios and they've got these, you know, they're out at a lake at a sunset or a sunrise and they've got clouds and they've got trees and they've got rocks in the foreground, but it's not a good picture.
Yeah.
And one of the hallmark questions is like, would you want to live with that photo on your wall for 10 years? And even if they love the photo, you can almost kind of see the hesitation in their eyes that somewhere they know, you know, it might be really good for them, but they know that there's some of that kind of combination missing. And it's the ability to create those kind of compositions, adding 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4, and putting them in the right sequential order. That's the part that takes years of being out there, of years of clicking the button, and then really trying to look objectively with what you've got on the screen once you've got it back and you're sitting there in Lightroom or Camera Raw or whatever program you're using. to really stop and study what you got and to figure out why was this image better than that image. And that's the long process of it.
It sounds like a long learning process. Obviously, when you have to wait for things like weather and you have to wait for things like light in order to really be able to, test your skills, I suppose. But as somebody who teaches workshops, as somebody who has attended other workshops, as you said, there are those elements: the light, the composition, subject matter. Seeing images from photographers of all skill levels, which one do you think gets overlooked the most?
Probably the light. um, Especially from well, I will have to amend that to two sides. I'd say from a beginning perspective, someone walking out in the camera, I think, while they may not have the understanding of light, they certainly have this kind of intuitive sense of pointing the camera at what they like to see. Learning, I would say, the elements of composition and the visual pathway, constructing a photo so that the eye goes through it okay, is probably the first step, like, that I try and push people up the ladder. So I know that in my own workshops, when I'm doing the critiques, it's simple things like checking the edges. Why do you have the branches? What if I'm, subject is over here? How about, making those kind of choices, and experimenting, because the first reaction most beginning photographers do is they'll see something and they bring their camera up to it and they go click. And that's the extent of what they do. So really trying to get them to work with this idea of perspective and connecting with what they're shooting as trying to tell a story. What is the story that you're trying to tell with this photo? What things do you think you could do to make it better? At least getting them to be aware of light and how light plays is a big thing. But from first step one, I would have to say composition and visual pathways is probably the biggest. If you're going to push someone up that ladder, that's the way I'm going to get them started.
So I think talking about visual pathways, that's something that maybe internally I think that I struggle with most when it comes to taking a photo of, just like a nice landscape. As you said, something that I find visually interesting, I want to take a photo of it, but then I have to ask myself, like, well, what is the main subject of this photo? Because when I shoot weddings, it's going to be the couple. When I have somebody in front of my frame, it's them. That's always the main subject of the photo. But when it comes to landscapes, and there's something like a rock that could be 10 feet in front of you, and a volcano that could be several miles in front of you.
Right.
How do we build the visual pathway, and where do we find what the main subject is? Does that question make sense? I kind of made that myself.
So I think that is at the very core of one of the other aspects I especially try and get to with a lot of my presentations. And if I could walk up with a baseball bat and hit people over the head with it, it's the one thing I would say is photography is a communication medium. People are like, wait, I thought it was just an art form. No, it is a communication medium, which means every single photo you take, you're telling a story. You're saying something about something. That's it. And that's the way a viewer's going to look at it. They're like going to know, what's the story this photographer is trying to tell me about this subject? So it doesn't matter if the subject is a single rock or a single flower or a bride and groom cutting the cake, or you've got a portrait of a person that you're setting up for some sort of assignment. You're always trying to communicate something with that image. And let's say for the example that you used, the rock and Mount Shasta, which is perfect because it's in the midst of this volcanic landscape, that it would be really an ideal setup to say, oh, here's a piece of volcanic rock that is sitting here 2.5 miles from the mountain, and how do I superimpose that so that they're in the frame together? And I am trying to say, this foreground rock came from that background mountain. So the first thing you know is you have to have both of them in the frame, but then aligning the perspective, like using the rule of thirds and composition, so that if those are on a diagonal like this, if they're like straight across like that, it's not as much of a story as if they're pulled apart or, okay, you know, and finding that kind of balance where you're creating the relationship between the background and the foreground, so that when a viewer sees that, they see foreground rock. Let's see how I do this here.
There
and
we
then
go.
Background volcano. It's those, you know, how you construct it in the frame that helps lead your eye from one to another, but it also establishes that there is a relationship between the two. And if the rock is down on the ground, if you're shooting from 5 feet 4 inches up, which is the average spot beginner photographers like to take their photos up, you know, it's like, no, get down on the ground, you know, put the foreground rock up like that, you know, and then match it with a little tiny mountain in the background. That's, you know, that's an option that's going to tell a story in slightly a different way than if they're both kind of equalized in the frame.
I like that. I like tying in those stories, or the element of story there as well, and I think that really helps me kind of figure out how to compose photos a little bit better. So thank you very much for sharing that.
It really is. You know, they say every photo is worth 1,000 words, or should be, or could be, but it's that the photo is worth X words just reinforces the idea that you're trying to use photography to communicate something.
Mm-hmm.
And if you walk around and say, what am I trying to communicate with this photo? That's a good way to kind of get you into those better positions to create better photos.
That's why you're the pro here. That was perfect. I want to switch gears just a little bit now, and I want to know that as one of the very few people in the entire world who make a living from your landscape photographs, I want you to talk to me a little bit about the business of landscape photography. How do you recommend somebody new to landscape photography, even where do you recommend that they even begin to start earning money with their photos?
You are listening to the free version of the Beginner Photography Podcast, where each week you learn how world-class photographers see and capture the world around them. If you want to hear the extended interview with their best business tips to learn how to make money with your camera, then become a premium member today by heading over to beginnerphotographypodcast.com and click the premium membership button to join now.
I believe that, and I'm going to play devil's advocate here for a second and ask you, what is the role that Instagram plays in your landscape photography?
Not a lot. In fact, I don't think I've posted more than a couple images since the pandemic began. I know that, a number of photographers who have done incredibly successful at Instagram and built up quite a following.
Mm-hmm.
But again, I think a large part of that is the photographers that want to learn from them so they can do what they do. That said, I've also known several photographers, and myself included. One, I have a very kind of, I don't want to say bitter reaction, but I definitely, I feel a bit saddened by the fact that they have made photography so Insta and so overwhelming in terms of the flow of content that people scroll by on this little device and they barely give some of these excellent photos more than a second worth of attention, and barely the effort to absorb more than a double tap and move on. So as far as someone who really likes to dig in and dive and look at the meat of a photographer's body of work or what they're trying to show me, it's like, oh, when I get on Insta, it's just like scroll, 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 tap, 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 make a quick comment and stuff like that. But I think people also strive for the psychology of affirmation. And before I switched to my theater degree, I was actually my bachelor's degree was in social and adolescent psychology. And this idea of the dopamine hit for the like, I specifically know photographers out there who get so wrapped up in, I'm going to do this for the numbers, or, oh, if I didn't get the numbers on this image, it must mean that image is not good. And that's kind of a pervasive set. And I've known someone that literally came up to me and said, I'm out to kill the Instagram thing. I'm going to slay it. And he did. He made that, and he's done great for it. And there is, once you get to that point, there will be a market for people that want to learn from you. And that is all very well and fine. It's getting to that point. I just have, and I guess that I might feel different if I was 20 years younger at the moment and living on my phone. But as someone who likes to go into a museum and stare at, a 3-foot photograph hanging on a wall and just really kind of soaking it in, Insta is the exact opposite. And I think what it has really done is it has deadened our senses to the appreciation of photography. We see it, we know it's good, and bam, we have just moved on to the next thing so fast we don't know why it was good.
Oh wow, we see it, we know it's good, and then we just move on. That's a sad thought. You're right. I mean, that's a real sad thought. And there's been photographers who I've talked to. I'm thinking of Dan Milner right now. He is if you don't know Dan Milner, he was a photojournalist in Texas, and then this was I guess in the late 70s. Kind of grew up in this publishing world, and then once social media came around, he realized, he's like, this is the worst thing I think to happen to photography. And he just completely swears off it. And now he still shoots on his Leica M6s and just prints every single one of his photos and makes books out of them. And he's like, this is how I enjoy photography. And I think that there's a lot, that episode has really resonated with a lot of listeners, because I think that they can see themselves getting caught up in that same dopamine hit, like you said. And that does take a lot of the joy and the fun out of being there in the moment and being excited about the photo to capture. Because if it only gets 7 likes or whatever, then that's going to negatively affect how you see the photo, and that's a shame. That's a shame. Is there anything that you do about that? Do you specifically try to print photos? Do you specifically do something to ensure that you continue to appreciate true photography?
Yeah, I definitely try and go to individual photographer websites and I look at their portfolios on their website. Now, to be fair, during the start of the pandemic, I kind of took a break from the Instagram and posting online from my business side. Now, I have a business page. This is one other thing I would say. My business Instagram account is a far different beast from my personal business account or my personal Instagram page. The personal one is me personally, and it's the stuff that I do. But when I post something on my Instagram business page, I'm curating that like a professional photo editor. I'm trying to not just think of one photo, but I'm also thinking of how does this match in a stream of colors or subject matter, so that I'm bringing up stuff that is, when someone brings up the whole page, that they're looking at it as kind of like this gestalt kind of portfolio, and I don't have 7 orange sunsets run together. So I'm really kind of picking and choosing. But I did have to think of that as kind of, Instagram felt like a business thing I had to do. But I also did it with the mindset of like, I'm not going to care about the numbers. I will go ahead and post it. One, just because I like sharing my photos. I have in the past taken breaks from, photographer sites and sharing. And then I just realized at some point, if people aren't seeing the work, they should. And I want them to see the work. But I just don't go out there, because places like Instagram, they reward people who spend more time on the app. Mm-hmm. And I don't want that fish hook in my mouth. And I just like, if someone said I was going to have to spend 4 hours a day hanging out on Instagram to bump their algorithm up and to build a crowd, I'm like, that's not the way I want to spend 4 hours of my day.
Yeah, no
kidding. So, sadly I do. It's like, it's a work thing. It's like I have to shift and say, that's part of my job. Like, opening mail. I also don't like to do, but it has to get done sometime, right?
I don't know if this will help, but I was definitely in that trap of like, wanting to grow the Instagram, and because that's what you're told from everybody. And that was me. I found that I was spending so much time on Instagram, and yet for no reason whatsoever, that I pretty much completely cut it off. Now what I do, I just schedule everything. So once a month I take, an hour, schedule out all the photos that are going to be posted with a program called, I think it's called Planali or something like that. And it just automatically pushes those images to Instagram.
That is a great way to do it, because yeah, especially, I mean, I've seen and know of photographers that have gone down the psychological rabbit hole when it's become so all obsessive and so compulsive that they find the rest of their existence has gotten wrapped up and tied up into this kind of online push to, especially for landscapes, to have these epic landscapes. Mm-hmm. And there is a bit of a psychological trap in there that if you're not careful, it can catch you in the wrong areas.
That's inspiring right there, and I'm glad that that it's not so much just about obviously the time shooting, the amount that you've been in the field. You're going to have all that great information, and going forward, be able to kind of leverage yourself in that possibility. But I love that story of this woman and her cat. That is that's great. I love it too. You what, I'd be in Europe and I'd be eating all the croissants and I'd be like, "Thank you, Mr. Fluffy." Like, this is all thanks to you. I know that we are at the end of our time here. Do you have time for 2 more questions? Is that
sure,
okay?
Absolutely.
I'm sure that there are times where, when it comes to landscape photography, you plan a photo. You know when the sunset's going to be. You know what your subject matter is going to be, and then you get out into the location, and maybe, not everything works. Maybe the weather doesn't cooperate or something like that. How do you make do in those situations?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, that happens a lot. So it's basically pre-visualizing a scene. And in fact, I think one of the images I sent you of this red light on top of Half Dome was exactly that. It was a scene that I had pre-visualized in my head, and I had walked out there and with a buddy of mine, and all of a sudden the clouds came in from everywhere, and I was just like, oh crap. And my pre-visualized image went completely out the door, and here I am in this big landscape with crappy weather, and this, like, exactly what I said, a great subject in boring light was still going to make a boring a boring photograph. So I started shifting my minds, like, oh, well, maybe I could do stuff that's like black and white because of all the storm clouds or something like that. And so it's kind of saying, well, if I can't do this, then, like I said, I'm going to start thinking first and foremost about the light. If the light is completely wrong, where is it correct? I had an instance where I was at Mount Rainier, and I was at that beautiful reflection lake with Mount Rainier, in the background, and the light was just blah up on the mountain. But the sun coming through the trees at the far end of the lake was making these beams on the mist, and it was like fabulous. And, I just like, okay, that's where my camera is going to be pointing, because it's pointing at what's interesting with the light. I let that kind of guide me to whatever the subject should be. It didn't matter anymore that Mount Rainier was in the question or in the photograph, because this image that was just trees and sunlight and mist was so more fabulous than anything looking in that big, huge mountain off to my other shoulder. And so that's the way with that Half Dome image. I was like, well, I'm just going to have to adapt. Maybe I'm going to start looking for smaller details. It's a 9-mile hike. I might as well do something while I was here. And interestingly, on that one image of Half Dome, there was 1 second or one brief moment where the light got through the clouds right as it was setting way off to the west and hit Half Dome and bathed it in that beautiful red light, just like I was imagining. And, I couldn't believe the luck. I was literally jumping up and down next to my camera, because I had completely said, this is never going to happen. And then all of a sudden it happens. The one thing I knew was I was kind of just being able to anticipate, and I left my camera just sitting right there. And because, at that point it's like, there's nothing to take pictures here. I might as well sit down and have a cup of tea and
enjoy the show.
The scenery.
Yeah.
And then the light snuck through this clouds and bathed Half Dome in this red light. I'm jumping up down next to my tripod, and I'm yelling at my friend who's like 20 yards away from me, is this happening? Is this really, really happening? When I got back and put all the frames into Lightroom, I counted from the first moment that light turned on to the last moment the light was there was 42 seconds.
Wow. Be prepared.
Out of an entire day. So I figured, my whole day. In fact, I processed some of the images from earlier in the afternoon, like as black and whites. I even did some of them as sepia tone to make them look like they were shot back in the 1840s when Yosemite was kind of first discovered by, or when William Henry Jackson was out there taking photographs. So I had done all those, but then that's what they say is luck favors the prepared. But if the luck doesn't happen, look around, change your mindset, figure out what would the light work well on. And, in the end, sometimes just put the camera down. Enjoy where you are and what you're doing. Because taking photos can take away from the moment. It's great that we can see these epic moments, but certainly if the epic moment from photography isn't happening, you still sitting by a quiet lake next to a beautiful mountain in a forest is a pretty epic moment, with or without a camera in your hand.
Very true. That's like that old bumper sticker. A bad day on the lake is better than a good day at the office, or whatever.
Absolutely.
Oh, man. Gary, you have given me so much to think about today. You have opened up my eyes into truly what the world of landscape photography looks like. And I can't thank you enough for coming on and sharing everything that you did. But before I let you go, for those listening, can you let them know where they can find you online and where they can see some of your amazing photos?
Sure. I've got my website, and it is enlightphoto.com. So it's a contraction of my business name, which is Enlightened Images Photography. And that's ENLIGHTPHOTO.com. Or they could probably just Google my last name or my name, and it should pop up hopefully near the top.
It does. It does. I can confirm.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm glad that you didn't point them to your Instagram. That would have kind of negated that whole conversation.
If they really want to see it, there's a link on my website that'll get them there.
Yeah. You know what I found interesting when I was doing a little bit of research on you was to look at the photos that you're tagged in and seeing maybe other people's stories that they had either at some of your workshops or photos that they took that were inspired by some of yours. And that was just really fun. So I would still recommend checking out the Instagram. That's
the part of Instagram I do like.
Yeah.
I mean, it's definitely not all bad. So no, it's not something I'm saying to avoid.
What did I tell you? Friendly and knowledgeable. One of my biggest takeaways from this interview here today with Gary was just that quote that he had, that phrase, that idea of that you are saying something by showing something. And too often I get lost in that in my own work. Everything that you show in a photo is saying something about the story that you're trying to tell. And I love how Gary just really brought together the idea of storytelling within like rocks and trees and stuff. These non-living things. Well, trees are living, but you know what I mean. Like where there's not so much a clear story by just looking at something, but you as the photographer have the ability to create that story. You can tell the story that you want to tell. And that was just great, So, but that is it for this week. Until next week, I want you to get out, I want you to shoot more, and I want you to make do. I want you to make more, I want you to do more, and I want you to make do with what you got, because I promise you, it is better than you think. I'll see you next week. Stay safe.
Thank you for listening to the Beginner Photography Podcast. If you enjoy the show, consider leaving a review in iTunes. Keep shooting, and we'll see you next week.